hello, wine-drinking people. Time for more of what I've had to drink yesterday, and always happy to attend the Hollywood Wine Society's events. These guys, the oldest wine group in South Florida. They've been meeting since 1971, the first Tuesday of every month. And almost without exception, like I said, these guys put on amazing tasting. So when our good friend and customer Jerry Bergheim called up and said, Andrew, would you like to help me host this 2003 Bordeaux tasting? I've heard a lot about this vintage. I haven't got to taste enough of the wines. I just happen to have a dozen or more in the store, Jerry. So, man, happy to put together the books and anything you guys need. Like I said, I will work for wine, and just tasting these 12 wines was definitely worth putting this tasting together. And I tried to give the tasters a cross-section of this vintage, which was a very exciting vintage, but it had its highs and lows. I remember the 2003 vintage vividly, and when they were picking the grapes, I had consumers calling me wanting to order futures. Well, futures don't go on sale until May of the following year or June. Some of the first growth prices don't come out sometimes till July. So we were still 6 months or more away from getting prices on these wines, but there was a lot of hype about this vintage. And even while the grapes were being picked, like I said, hey, it was a hot year everywhere in 2003. Hundreds of people lost their lives in places like Paris and throughout Europe where they don't believe in air conditioning. 120 degrees at Chateau Lafite one day, they had to close their doors. They said it's too hot to taste Chateau Lafite today. So very unique conditions, a drought situation for most of the summer also. But hey, Mother Nature looked down and shined upon them the 3 days in August where they got rain, the 3 days in September when they needed it just enough to get the grapes over that hump and to get them ripe, because you still have to have rain. You have extreme heat, and the grapes cannot finish their ripening process. So a very unique vintage and a great vintage for some. Pomerol, we left the Pomerol wines out of this tasting. Not a great showing for Pomerol, and Pessac the same way. So I try to focus on the highs, the better areas, like Pauillac was outstanding, Saint Estèphe was outstanding. Margaux, hit or miss. I think Chateau Margaux, definitely the wine of the vintage in Margaux. And like I said, man, we had entry-level wines. And to me, the 03s at the entry level are ready to drink like that right now. Some of the more nouveau style wines need a little, or maybe gone past their, their window of optimum drinkability. And then, some of these entry level wines could still go another 5-10 years. But I think they're starting to peak. We started out with Clos de l'Oratoire from Saint-Emilion, Chateau Jaune and Bicot from Côte de Castillon, and Cabernet Gascoton from Saint Estèphe. And these three wines, of those three, my favorite was the Cabernet Gascoton, not just because I have that to sell, but for a Saint Estèphe, to me, this wine had wonderful balance. This was where the vintage was strongest. This estate is owned by the same folks that own Colon Segur, and this wine had a little bit of a green bell peppery kind of note to it, currants, plum, cedar, cigar box spice, just to me, classic Saint Estèphe drinking at its peak. Very good wine, and at $24, I mean, nearly half the cost of either one of these wines. The Jaune and Bicot, to me, maybe not a perfect bottle, a little bit oxidized, but still had some fruit coming through. So one of the tasters thought it was corked. It was not corked, but like I said, you get some other flaws in the cork, like advanced oxidative qualities, which this wine seemed to have. It could have just been the style and that the wine was made. Anyways, the Clos de l'Oratoire, a classic Saint-Emilion, just lovely plum and cherry fruit. Wonderful balance here, wonderful freshness, maybe a little short on the finish, but a really good example of a Saint-Emilion drinking at its peak. $52. And then the next flight, we had the second wines. All the wines in Bordeaux make a second wine. Hey, Chateau Mouton makes a third wine now. Their second wine's so expensive, they needed a third wine to get their entry-level Bordeaux consumers to taste their wines. But these are all these are all Grand Cru Class A wines. We have one first growth in this flight, the Carruades de Lafite, and I always say the best value in Bordeaux is a great wine, a second wine, and a great vintage. So the Carruades, Lafite was one of the wines of the vintage. This Carruades, to me, blew away the Clos de Marquis and the Sarge de Gras de Rose. Well, actually, the Clos de Marquis was a little bigger, a little richer, maybe need a little more time, but the Carruades was just so delicious. It was one of the most my favorite wines of the whole tasting. This wine had a lovely Asian spice and kind of pencil-lead character to it. Currant and red currant, red plum fruit, just a silky smooth texture on the tongue, and this lovely kind of smoky barbecue-y kind of note to it. Wonderful freshness, that lovely incense spice, and all that minerality showing through on the finish, that Asian spice and smoke, and just, like I said, incredible balance. Definitely the best wine on the table to drink today. The Grand La Rose was nice, definitely a little more evolved than the Clos de Marquis. The Clos de Marquis seemed like it needed more time. That's the second wine of Leoville Las Casas, and all three of these wines, though, excellent. All right, on to the super seconds through fifths. Chateau Lynch-Bages, a lot of times mistaken for Chateau Latour in blind tastings. This wine was most excellent. This showed the strength of the vintage. Pauillac. Saint Julien, also very good. My favorite wine of the night, the Leoville Las Casas. This wine just killer. And it needed a while to open up, but it just had a host of earth, gravelly, minerally notes, cigar box spice to complement that rich currant and plum fruit, and some light smoky notes. Incredible complexity here. This wine had a firm hand of tannins here. Definitely needs a little bit of time, as does the Leoville Barton. All three of these guys showed why they're three of the top wines made in Bordeaux. And still, it's somewhat enjoyable to drink now, but definitely needed a little bit of time. The Pavé, the Margaux, and the Mouton were really good, but I have to say, man, this ossified classification that they have from 1855, very little difference from the first gross and great vintages than the great gross like Leoville Las Casas and Lynch-Bages, because I thought those two wines were as good as the Mouton, the Margaux, and the Pavé. A lot of people looked at me and said, Pavé, a first growth? Yes, well, Pavé was elevated to first growth status, I think, as of 2010 or 9, but just recently in the last 5 vintages. And someone said, well, so does that mean 03 automatically gets elevated? Well, of course it does, man. When Mouton was elevated in 1973, all prior vintages became a first growth at that point. Anyways, interesting conversation. The Margaux, definitely the most drinkable. The Pavé seemed to be a little more evolved than these two, but all three of these blockbusters, as was the Latour Blanche, and this was my last bottle, two half bottles of Latour Blanche 03, just stunning wine. Some people did not think these wines had the acid to last, but let me tell you, this wine's just got lots of everything, an incredible amount of honey, peaches, apricots, incredible richness and viscosity, but wonderful freshness, man. A great tasting of 2003s with the Hollywood Wine Society. I'm your host, Andrew Lamposoni, signing off for the Wine Watch, saying, remember,